Hello and welcome to the Oort Cloud podcast. My name is Rick Adler and today I'm talking to Cory Doctorow. Cory is the author of science fiction novels including Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom and Someone Comes to Town, Someone Leaves Town, and stories including those in a great new collection called Overclocked. He's one of the contributing bloggers on the ever-popular Boing Boing Net and an activist on issues of copyright and digital rights management with a long-standing relationship with the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Currently, he is a visiting professor at the University of Southern California's Center on Public Diplomacy. Hi, Cory. How are you today?
Well, I'm okay. How are you?
I'm doing very well, thank you. I really want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us today.
Not at all. It's my pleasure.
Just to get us started, I wanted to ask you a few questions about science fiction and the world of publishing. As someone who's written a lot of science fiction and had it published, what are your thoughts overall about the state of science fiction writing and publishing today?
Well, clearly it's in a lot of flux, as is every, knowledge goods business, every business related to intangible things that can be digitized and circulated on the Internet. And not just because those things, not just because science fiction can be digitized and circulated on the Internet, although that obviously changes the game a little, but because we live in an era today where there is much more to do with your discretionary time on a much shorter leash and with a much lower search cost for locating things that you might find interesting than ever before. So science fiction now exists in a much more competitive market in terms of things that might distract the kind of people who might want to read your science fiction books.
Attention as the ultimate limited commodity.
Yeah. Yeah, well, until we can fork multiple instances of ourselves.
Right, exactly. I'd like to stay with your life as an author for a moment. I've heard you say in recent interviews that for writers, it's important not to turn writing into a ceremony. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so this is like an authorly advice snippet. When I started writing, it was very natural. It was, I was a kid and something would inspire me. I'd get a story idea and I'd just sit down and I'd start writing it. But over time, I became much more ceremonial. And what that means is that I started to do things like require a cigarette before I could write, or require that I could play a certain number of hands of solitaire with consecutive wins before I could write, or that I had to do the dishes before I could write, or that I had to have the right music before I could write, and so on. And eventually I got to this place where the thing that made me happiest in the world, which is writing, was connected to a whole bunch of genuinely meaningless, pointless rituals that I had no, actual relationship to writing, some of which were actively bad for me, like smoking, and that ultimately meant that I wrote less and was less happy. And I looked at the path that I was on, and I saw that, the long-term trajectory was that I wouldn't be able to write until I'd, done that scene out of the Three Amigos where they go to the bush and they circle it 3 times and salute the invisible swords and fire their guns into the air and shout yippee 3 times in a row. and worse, right? I could only write on Wednesdays or I could only write in the mornings. And what I focused on instead, and this was much more driven by necessity than any kind of effort of will, is I just focused on writing a certain amount every day. And not worrying about when I did that, where I did it, not worrying about whether the circumstances were ideal. The circumstances are non-ideal much more often than they're ideal. And so I just started writing, I was doing all this travel. I was doing all this, road time. And when I just started writing in, airport lounges, I'd write on subways, I'd write on escalators. Literally, I'd have my 250 words to do that day, and I'd write 100 of them sitting on the platform and 50 of them on the subway and the last 100 of them going up the escalator out of the London Tube. And just get it done. Just get the job done. The thing is that I think that if you're going to be a professional writer, whatever that means, obviously professional is a loaded term in a world in which almost no one earns a living from doing nothing but writing, particularly writing novels. If you're going to make this your lifelong vocation, it would be better if it were something that you just did rather than something that you had to be moved to do. Garbage men don't get garbage men's block. Surgeons don't get surgeon's block. The barista at Starbucks doesn't get cappuccino block. Right? If it's your job, you do it. there are days when I write and it feels like what comes out is brilliant, and there are days when I write and it feels like what comes out is garbage. And when I go back and I reread it, I can't tell the difference. And maybe that's because I write garbage all the time. But there's my conclusion is that there's just no correlation between what feels like good writing and what ends up being good writing when you're done. Those feelings are in your head, not on the page.
And it does seem as if the increasing pace of life means that you really do have to become. I was saying to Paul, the co-founder of Oort, you've got this reputation as a master of working on fiction in the in-between moments, just like you're saying. Do you think that would have been possible before the onset of new technologies? I mean, do new technologies make that possible in a way that they wouldn't have been that wouldn't have been possible before?
Well, I don't know. That's a hard question to ask because, would I have so many interstitial moments as opposed to long, protracted blocks to focus on if it hadn't been for all that goddamn new technology? Would I spend as much time on the road? And ironically, the global instantaneous universal data network means that I have to get into a plane every 3 days and go somewhere else to talk to someone about it. But I don't know. I think that we can lay a lot of good and bad things at the feet of technology, but my ability to get stuff done in the interstices, I don't know if that qualifies, because surely I could get a whole lot done in a world in which I was jotting notes down in a moleskin. The fact that I have a laptop with me doesn't make a giant difference. Although, I guess where there's Wi-Fi, I can look stuff up and therefore get to my research questions faster. But on the other hand, it means that I'm more prone to skiving off and answering email instead of getting some work done. With research questions, if anything you're not sure of when you're writing, this is one of my favorite journalism tricks that a lot of fiction writers don't know about, I think, is to just insert the letters TK whenever you come up against something that you don't actually have the answer for, like, the lifting power of the Hindenburg was TK tons. TK stands for to come, although misspelled, as in these facts are to come later. And the reason it's misspelled that way is that TK does not appear in a lot of English words. So you can search a document later for TK, and unless you're writing something about the Atkins diet, all the TKs you find will be about things that you forgot to put in.
But the important thing is just stay with the flow and just keep writing.
Yeah. It's to have the writing habit. There's an interesting book called The Now Habit that the reason I bring it up is that it broaches the idea of doing stuff that you want to get done habitually instead of extraordinarily. Making it the thing that you do. I mean, it doesn't take an effort of will to make a cup of coffee in the morning or to have some breakfast or to go to bed at night. Those things just come naturally. You get them for free because you're in the habit of doing them. And so if you can get writing for free because you're in the habit of doing it, then you're really gone somewhere.
Okay. Now, we've been talking about the writing that you've been doing. Now, I know you've also written stories with Charles Strouse in the past, like Jury Service and its sequel, Appeals Court. Let's say you get a new idea for a story that comes to you. How do you decide if that idea is something that you'd like to cooperate with someone on, or if it's something that you'd rather develop on your own? Is there a difference between ideas that you get?
It's my collaborations are rare enough that it's pretty circumstantial and unique. With Charlie, some of the story ideas came from me, some of the story ideas came from him. Some of them were really unfounded, where it was literally like, here's 500 words, you write the next bit, and we'll see where this takes us. Sometimes what happens with collaborations, what happened with Jury Service, actually, was that Charlie had a story he was stuck on, so he had the first 1,500 words as a snippet on his hard drive that he sent to me. And I embraced and extended what he'd done. But I don't know that there's any kind of, now that I say it and I think about it, more than half of the collaborations I've done have been things that I was stuck on, where a fresh pair of eyes helped me sort it out. And those often tend to be kind of funny stories, because the outcome, oftentimes the reason that you're stuck is because you've kind of written yourself into a corner, and the way that you get unstuck is by thinking very laterally, which a second set of eyes can help you with, but which turns out to be pretty gonzo most of the time.
Well, that kind of goes right into sort of Oort Cloud territory there. I mean, at Oort Cloud we talk about this term that Paul Hartzog coined called open lit. I'm not sure he coined it actually, but at least it's something we talk about. The idea that writing and reading are both things to be shared, so that, on the writer's side, we're talking about the fact that writers ultimately want their stories to be read, but we're also talking about the idea of shared worlds in which someone might come up with an idea for a setting or a plot and then share those ideas with other people so that they can contribute their own ideas about them. And then on the reader's side, the idea that readers want to share their reactions, they want to recommend stories that they like to other readers, and then also give their own feedback back to authors and make their own suggestions. I mean, I'd be curious to hear what you think about that.
So, I am of multiple minds about this because it's pretty far off from the way that I work. Although I'm a very internet-oriented writer, that's not what I do when I'm being internet-oriented. Bruce Sterling gave this talk, very provocative talk at South by Southwest a couple of months ago, not last month, I guess, about mashups and about fan fiction and about a lot of other kind of internet genre material. And he said that none of it is good art. None of it has that aesthetic sensibility that you get out of great creation. And I think Bruce is wrong. But I think the reason that he's wrong is that he's paying attention to the wrong part of the process, or the wrong piece of it to judge its aesthetic merit. Although I would argue that at least in the case of musical mashups, there's a lot of music mashups that I think of as being as good as any piece of music in my collection. Again, maybe I have terrible taste in music, but I think that, for example, DJ VC's Beatles Beastie Boys remixes are as good as anything the Beatles themselves actually produced. But that said, what Bruce I think was missing is that the point of that kind of creative endeavor, that kind of collective creative endeavor where a bunch of people collaborate that way, is not so much the outcome or the destination, but rather it's the journey. That the aesthetic benefit, the artistic experience of that work, is the artistic experience of participating in it. So while reading a great novel might make you feel something as you read it, participating in the authorship of a novel that on the traditional scale might not be considered great might produce a similar feeling because of the participation, not because of what the words say, but because of how the words were written and the fact that you were doing it. So in that sense, it's a little like evaluating, it's like evaluating sex by what's left behind on the sheet. The important thing isn't what's left behind on the sheet. The important thing is how it got there. And I think that's what Bruce missed.
Okay, that's interesting. Let me talk a little bit about your podcast. You've had that going for a while now, in which this podcast in which you give readings of your stories, and sometimes your reading stories are actually still in progress.
Yeah.
How does podcasting fit into your life? I mean, aside from being a go to actually finish a story, I mean, how did that come into your life as a writer, and where did you get the idea for doing it in the first place?
Well, I've wanted to do a podcast of reading my stories for a while. I love reading my stories aloud. I love doing this at science fiction conventions. I've been doing it forever since I sold my first story. I've been always asked for a reading slot at the con, and I love doing it. I loved going to writers' readings before I started selling my own work and reading it at cons. I just love the written word read aloud. And my problem had been that I felt like I couldn't produce something polished enough to really present to the world. That too much of what I did would end up being kind of noisy and gonky and would have all kinds of problems and it would have me kind of flying when I missed words, and I didn't want to have to go through all that time to edit it, and that it would be such a big piece to bite off that I never finished chewing it and I never digest it. And Mark Pesce, the guy who created VRML, was at a conference with me in Montreal, and I was telling him about this. And he said, "Oh, it's just dumb. Just do it. Just put it out there, and say, well, I'm sitting on a friend's sofa in Oregon. I gave a talk at HP Research yesterday. That noise you hear is the street noise of suburban Portland. I'm getting on an airplane an hour, and here's the reading for today. And then tomorrow, make the reading you're reading from Singapore, and with the street noises there. And don't worry about it. Make it a feature and not a bug. Make the fact that this is raw, that this is work in progress, that this is you, the writer, communicating directly to the reader, and not some mediated product, but rather a kind of sharing into one of the salient features of the podcast. That's what I've done, I hope, in the podcast. It's certainly been my goal in the podcast. And, that goad is also very important. It does really keep me honest and keep me writing. I think that the best method now is to get about 7,000 or 8,000 words in the can, and then start reading it for like a 22,000 word novella, and then start reading it, and you end up reading. If you read for like half an hour to 40 minutes a week, you end up finishing the story and the reading more or less at the same time, at least if you write about it at my pace. So I'm doing that right now. I'm prepping a novella to read aloud, something called There's a Great Big Beautiful Tomorrow, Now is the Best Time of Your Life. That's a kind of riff on Disney's Carousel of Progress that I'm almost finished the first of 4 acts on, and will probably work out to be about 25,000 words.
Well, that's good news.
Yeah.
Actually, yes, and since you brought that up, I wanted to ask, apparently you've got another novel called Little Brother coming?
Yeah, I finished 2 novels before Christmas. One's a May 2008 title. I don't know when the next one is coming. They're both Tor books. Little Brother is my young adult novel about hacker kids who declare war on the Department of Homeland Security. And it's a young adult novel. Every chapter has got technical projects that the protagonists undertake that you can build that will defeat DHS security and other kinds of kind of security theater or fake security or authoritarian security that make up the world of all of us, but especially of young people. And that's, as I say, that's a May 08 title. And we're looking at doing some really exciting stuff. Like I've been talking to people at Instructables who do illustrated how-tos about doing an illustrated how-to or series of illustrated how-tos about the stuff that's in the book. So we'll actually have like a real-world tie-in of, if you like this book, you can do this. I'm also thinking about maybe setting up a Flickr group of one of the things that these people do, these kids do, is they take photos of people in authority abusing their authority, and they blog them, and they feed them to the media. And I'm thinking about setting up a Flickr group for doing the same thing.
Well, that sounds wonderful.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, a lot of your discussions have also been about copyright and issues of DRM and all. And one question I've been wanting to ask you, most of the discussions about copyright, about DRM, tend to focus on how it's being used by publishers, music labels, and studios. And obviously those are very serious concerns. But, and I think this is kind of going along with what we've been talking so far, I'm also wondering if, as we were talking about the premise of open lit and all, might also get into questions about how authors view their relationship to their own work, with respect to ownership. Where I'm going with this is, you have some creators like yourself who are posting stories online and making them available for people who haven't read them before as a way of getting the word out. Tim O'Reilly's idea of the problem is obscurity. You need to overcome that if you want to make a living as a writer. And yet you have other authors who seem to be reluctant to do that because it may have an impact on their revenue stream. I guess I'm wondering, is part of the problem or the challenge of addressing DRM and restrictive copyright law, may that also be not just a question of how it's being used by media corporations, but also a question of support that may be receiving from creators themselves?
Well, I think that, there's what some Marxists call false consciousness, or as my friend Teresa Nielsen Hayden, who actually works for a publisher, says, just because you're on our side doesn't mean that we're on your side. So there are a lot of artists who might take the label's side or the publisher's side. But I think that they're wrong to do so. But I also think that, unfortunately, for better or for worse, authors don't have a lot of control over the destiny of the publishing industry anyway. So, the fact that authors may embrace DRM doesn't actually make publishers embrace DRM any more than the fact that authors want, legible, honest, easy to read, regularly produced, audited spreadsheets showing their royalty statements means that publishers will produce them. I mean, if publishers did the bidding of authors, it would be a very different world in general. So I'm very skeptical of the idea that the musicians who for years have been trying to, for example, get the record labels to let them keep their publishing rights, or to report on their royalties accurately, or to let them choose where they want to record if they're going to be spending their own money to do it, and all this other stuff. That somehow, although they've never managed to get any of that really substantive stuff that would make a huge difference to them, they are somehow responsible for the publishers taking this extraordinary step of adding DRM to their work. I just don't think that it's very likely. That's not to say that there aren't writers and musicians and filmmakers who think that they need this. They're wrong in my view, but I just don't think that we as writers have a lot of influence over what our publishers do. I mean, maybe J.K. Rowling has influence, but how many of us can say that we account for the single-handedly account for the share price of our publishers?
Fair enough. Now, speaking of publishers, I mean, you have your own relationship with the publishers that you've worked with. They've agreed to your idea of letting the text of your stories be available for download on the net. I'm kind of curious about how did those discussions go? Did you have to make a bit of a case for doing that? Were they open to the idea of doing it?
Well, so I'll tell you, it was different with different publishers, and it was the opposite of what you might expect. So the traditional wisdom goes that small, author-oriented boutique publishers are nimble and able to adapt to the Internet, whereas large, monolithic corporate publishers owned by giant multinationals are dumb and lumbering and incapable of turning their business strategy around. And it was actually the reverse that happened for me. My short story collections came from small, boutique-y, author-centric publishing houses, first from a house called Four Walls, Eight Windows, and then from the house that bought them, Avalon, which has now since been bought by Perseus. And these presses, although they were very good, and generally my relationship with them was very, very good, and I'm glad that they did the books, and I think they did a great job with the books, they were really reluctant to allow for Creative Commons releases. They were way more conservative about Creative Commons than Tor was. And Tor, who published my novels, is the largest science fiction publisher in the world. They're owned by one of the largest publishing conglomerates in the world, which is called Holtzbrinck, a big family-owned multinational publishing interest. And with Tor, partly because they have a unique relationship with their parent company, Tom Doherty, who founded Tor and who sold it to Holtzbrinck, did so on the condition that he has total autonomy in the running of the business. And he apparently does, because no one seems to be able to make him do anything he doesn't want to do. And he, in turn, has a lot of trust in his senior people, including my editor, Patrick Nielsen Hayden, who's the senior editor for the line at Tor. So he edits this largest science fiction line in the world. And Patrick is a geek. I met Patrick on Genie, the General Electric Network for Information Exchange, a BBS system before the days of the commercial Internet. And Patrick runs his own Linux boxes, and he maintains his own movable type blog, and he writes his own movable type plugins. And he totally got this, right? When I said I wanted to do this, he was like, "You are absolutely the right guy to do this. This is absolutely the right thing to do for this book. Of course we'll make it available for free on the Internet. No problem. You go ahead and do this. We need to find out more about how this stuff can work. No one has yet made anything successful happen with electronic publishing on the Internet." As he said, words to the effect of electronic publishing has the worst ratio of hours of meetings held to dollars of revenue generated. of any piece of the publishing industry in recorded history. And so maybe you can figure out something to do. If nothing else, it doesn't require that you hold any meetings. We're just going to do this and see what happens. It doesn't cost us anything, and maybe we'll learn something useful from it. And I think they have, because some of their other authors have done the same thing now. And it was great. It was so easy. I had no discussion at all with them. It just happened. With the short story publishers, the way that it went down was with the second collection was that they at first had they balked a little at first, and then I pointed out that all the stories in the collection were already online under Creative Commons licenses, and that they bought this collection of stories that were online. And at that point, they said, "Oh, well, I guess then we can't really stop having you can't really insist that these stories not be online."
And they were also in your podcast by then, right?
Yeah, they're all in the podcast. Although, obviously that's although they might have objected to that in principle, it's not in the contract. They don't have audio rights. Those rights still belong to me. So.
Oh, okay. Well, it's interesting then. You've got different reactions from different publishers. One of the other discussions that we're sort of edging up on Oort Cloud is the question. We haven't actually brought up this specific example, but I know you're familiar with it. Lawrence Lessig has talked about the production of stagecoaches during the 19th century and how Studebaker was the only company that managed to survive the transition from making stagecoaches in the 19th century to making cars in the 20th century. And it seems like there's at least some possibility that the publishing industry might be facing a transition in the coming years that might be similar to that kind of a transition. Mm-hmm. And if that's true, let's say that you were in charge of a publishing house today. Are there things that you might do that you think might help a house prepare for something like that?
That's a really good question. I mean, I'm not in charge of a publishing house, which is good. I'm not the world's greatest business runner. I'm great at doing stuff independently, and I'm great at formulating my own personal strategy, but I'm not great at running a giant empire. That said, if someone said to me, what recommendations do you have for us for the next, say, 5 years as opposed to forever, I would start by revisiting the whole strategy around Google Publishing and say to Google, we don't have any problem with you presenting indexes of our work on the Internet. That's totally cool. What we have a problem with is the fact that you've gone to university libraries and you said that in exchange for scanning their libraries, or rather in exchange for giving them a copy of the scan of their library, you want them to guarantee you that no one else will be allowed to scan their library. In other words, that Google will have the only complete collection of these works that are represented in these rare library collections. And we want to revisit that question with you because we think that there should be book search on the web, but that it should work like web search, and everyone should have the same opportunity to index the same content the way that it works on the web today. We don't want to have just Google with an index of all the web pages on the Internet. And as a way of giving that some teeth, rather than threatening Google, which I don't think there's any legal basis to threaten Google for indexing books, I would say to Google, we have a production pipeline that results in the publication of hundreds of new works every year, and you can get access to those works for your index in two ways. One is you can wait till they're published, buy them in a store, and take them home and scrape them, right? Scan them and index them. Or we can give you the production pipeline as they're coming out, as they're headed for the printer. You can have a copy there in your hard drives directly through us for an API. So can anyone else. The deal is, though, that the only people who are allowed to have access to our production pipeline, who can get access to the most complete and up-to-the-minute index of books as they're published, are people who promise that they will never do an exclusive scanning deal with library collections. So it has to be on a non-exclusive basis. And then I would tell Google, if you want access to this stuff, you have to let the libraries out of their exclusivity deals. You have to let book search work like web search. I would immediately open up a Creative Commons download program for any author who wanted it. So I think that, there's also the question of, encouraging authors to do it. But for starters, to just say to any author who wants Creative Commons downloads, here you go, would be great. I would begin to cultivate fanfic communities, and particularly in science fiction, which is, lucky in that it has this incredibly avid fanfic writing world of people who are so engaged with the material that they actually make it their hobby. And I would engage directly with those people and start to encourage it, possibly host the best of it, or publish the best of it, and that sort of thing. That's off the top of my head. Mostly, although I don't necessarily know what to do, I'm pretty good at what not to do. And what not to do is, suing or threatening fans, suing or threatening people who make it easier to find your work and buy it, going after Amazon for used books. All that stuff is just junk. I think you can look at O'Reilly and Associates, the textbook publishers, for some amazing ways to address some of the challenges facing publishing. For example, one of the reasons that university textbooks cost as much as they do is that they are often resold to university bookstores and then bought again in the next semester by students. So obviously goods with a healthy, robust resale market have a higher, generally speaking, you can get a higher clearing price for that first sale on them. In the same way that, you would pay more for a car that you can sell when you're done driving it than you would if it were a car that you knew you couldn't sell when it was over. And part of the clearing price of a car represents the expected recovery of some of your costs in selling that car when you go out and you buy your next one, or when you get tired of it or leave the country or whatever. So that's that characteristic of a used goods market. The problem is that for academic publishers, this represents a big challenge. A lot of them are facing pressure to lower their prices, and they're getting really upset with the used book market, and they're fighting it, which is dumb, because, of course, the used book market is legal, and it's also a gateway drug for people who are cost-sensitive into the new book market. But what O'Reilly has done that's really genius is they've created a program called Safari U that also involves a number of other textbook publishers, in which university profs can go into a complete database of everything they've ever published, and they can piece together their own custom textbook based on chapters from various books that they want to include as they're reading. So they basically make a course pack using this web interface. And then the course pack is printed and bound like an O'Reilly book and shipped to the university for the class. So the interesting thing, well, there are many interesting things about this. It's exactly what the prof needs. It involves both cutting edge and older material. You don't have to worry if stuff is out of print or in print. But even more interesting is that there's no used market for this stuff. Not because they ban the used market, just because the text changes every year. There's a substantive new edition every year. And so O'Reilly's kind of found a way to deliver a cheap service that represents better value for students, better value for profs, and that eliminates a market that they felt were cutting into their profits without actually having to take any regulatory action or do anything sneaky or bad to get rid of it.
So in the end, it's ultimately, it seems as if openness, sharing, collaboration, that sort of an approach.
Well, all of that stuff is great, but in addition, not hoping that you can cause other people's existing lawful businesses to just disappear in order to increase your profits. That just can't be part of your business plan, because it's really risky. I mean, the Recording Industry Association has been trying it for a long time, and they haven't succeeded. But peer-to-peer doesn't require that the RIAA go out of business in order to flourish. But the RIAA says that they require peer-to-peer to go out of business in order to flourish. So in order for them to survive, they're requiring that lawmakers ban an entire sector of the tech industry. And that's a really hard sell, and it takes a long time. And in the meantime, they're hemorrhaging profits because they don't want to adjust to a world with peer-to-peer in it. They want to change the world to make peer-to-peer and leave it. And it just seems like a very risky strategy if what you're interested in is making sure that you can continue to pay your executives and that you'll never run out of discretionary funds to buy cocaine to snort off a hooker's tip if you are in the recording industry.
Well, yes, it certainly seems. I guess where I was heading with that was just to say it seems, again, sort of, I guess you could say in the sort of spirit of science fiction, it really ought to be about adapting to the reality of the circumstances that you're in and trying to find ways to live with it.
Yeah, I mean, the Internet is here to stay. And as I've been wont to say, bits are never going to get harder to copy. There's no future in which hard drives will become less capacious speaking of noises from the background here, there's no future in which hard drives are going to be less capacious. There's no future in which networks are going to be harder to get onto or slower. So, the Internet's going to be here forever. So you have to work with it, not against it. And while it's true that we can change the shape of the Internet by engaging with it, it seems unlikely to me that we're going to change the shape of the Internet such that it becomes less good at copying things. And the Internet's a machine for copying. That is what happens when you interact with the Internet, is that data that lives on a server in one place is copied to your computer in another place. And so while we may get the Internet to do lots of interesting tricks over the years to come, not copying is probably not one of them.
Okay. Well, Cory, I'd like to thank you very much for talking to us today. Before we close, I'd like to point out to everyone that you can be found at craphound.com, and also that you are still regularly posting at boingboing.net. Are there other places we can find you online?
No, that's kind of it. Well, I mean, lots of places, but they'll all be linked to from one or the other of those things. So that's it. I mean, there's my podcast, but that's on Craphound too. Yeah, it's all on Craphound. Oh, no, I take it back. I've been teaching a course at the University of Southern California all year. I have a Fulbright chair there. And there's a podcast of my lectures. So if you go to USC PWNED, USC Pwned, the course is called Pwned, uscpwned.blogspot.com, there's a podcast of all the lectures. So when it's done, I think we'll have 14 of the 15 lectures recorded. We had some sound problems in one of them. And they run between an hour and 3 hours. Sounds good.
All right. Well, thanks again, Cory. Appreciate your time very much. And
definitely.
Best of luck on your new projects.
Oh, well, thank you.